I live in a quiet little neighborhood just outside of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place that is close enough to the city for me to travel easily to work, but far enough removed from downtown that I don't have to deal with bumper-to-bumper traffic, just trying to get to the grocery store. Until recently, I had been assigned to the night shift where I work. One of those dock-in-the-box 24-hour urgent care clinics on nearly every corner that people go to in the middle of the night, when they don't want to go to the hospital for their food poisoning or questionable injuries. About a week ago, the center manager for the day shift went on maternity leave about a month early, leaving the position woefully unattended and in desperate need of replacement. The night shift is a surprisingly docile time of night for our facility, so upper management decided that my talents would be more efficiently applied if I were to fill the role in her absence, instead of continuing my regular duties as the night shift center manager. Normally, I would have been aggravated at a sudden change like this being forced on me without management consulting me first. But, fortunately for them, I had actually been mulling over the idea of asking for a daytime position for a few weeks now. Being nocturnal was starting to throw a wrench in my social life, as well as taking a toll on my mental and physical health. During fall and winter, there were many days where I never even got to see the sunlight, because I was waking up after the sun had set and going to bed just before it would rise. On certain weekend nights and holidays, I would be one of the only employees in the clinic, so I would go days without any kind of social interaction or sunlight. You don't think that kind of thing would have that much effect on you, but after 2 years of this routine, I was definitely getting burnt out. The nocturnal life just wasn't for me, so I was actually excited at the opportunity to transition to the day shift. The first couple of days were the hardest. Fortunately, I had a 2-day buffer between my last night shift and the first day shift that I was expected to work, which made the switch a bit less painful than it probably would have been if I was getting off work at 5 a.m., only to go back into work at 8 a.m. But nevertheless, there still was no perfect method of transitioning my schedule in under 48 hours. I toyed with quite a few ideas, but decided on staying up for the entire day following my last night shift, and going to bed that evening when I was painfully exhausted, thus forcing myself to adhere to a new sleep schedule. After coming home from my last night shift, I pulled into the driveway around 5:30 a.m., having stopped at a local fast food drive-thru to pick myself up some breakfast to celebrate my transformation into a diurnal member of society. I got out of my car and leaned back inside to grab my greasy cheese and sausage English muffin from the passenger side when I was startled to see my next-door neighbor staring at me from his porch. He was standing with one hand in his pocket, a cup of coffee in his other hand. A wide and sincere teeth-baring smile plastered across his face. Upon noticing my startled reaction, he seemed to chuckle to himself, raising his coffee mug to me in a gesture of greeting and acknowledgement, as if to say, "I've been standing here since before you ever got home. You're the one who just noticed me, you weirdo." I forced an awkward chuckle and half smile myself, not wanting to be that guy that finds other people's routines weird or shocking. After all, I was the one who hadn't seen the sun for nearly 6 days in a row. Stopping at the drive-thru had me arriving home 15 minutes later than usual anyway, due to the early morning breakfast rush. Maybe this guy's routine was always just to be up and enjoying his morning coffee at 5:30 a.m. on his front porch, and I had always just barely missed him. I had the feeling that I would be noticing all sorts of weird things about the activity of my daytime counterparts. After a few seconds of awkward silent good morning grunts and gestures, I took my sandwich inside and changed out of my scrubs. Instead of changing into my comfortable sleeping clothes, I opted for my day off jeans and a t-shirt. If I wanted to trick my brain into thinking I was a member of the sunlight-dwelling general population, I needed to dress the part. I didn't want to risk falling asleep out of habit and having to restart the entire process again tomorrow. I plopped down onto the couch with my greasy breakfast food and grabbed a bottle of iced coffee from the fridge. I turned on my TV and scrolled around Netflix until finally giving up and deciding to re-watch The Office for the 100th time. Unfortunately for me, even the combination of breakfast food and caffeine wasn't enough to trick my brain into thinking that it wasn't time for me to go to bed. I found myself starting to doze off as I scrolled through Twitter on my phone while half-heartedly listening to the antics of Michael Scott and the other colorful characters at Dunder Mifflin. Just before catching myself doing the "I totally wasn't sleeping just now" head jolt that people often do while dozing off in inappropriate places, I decided to get up and walk around to get my blood flowing and snap myself out of it. I stretched and walked my trash into the kitchen before wandering to the window by my front door and taking a peek outside. It was about 6:15 in the morning now, and the sun was just starting to turn the sky a pale shade of red instead of the milky black color I was used to seeing upon returning home from work. At the end of the street, I saw a kid riding a bike throwing newspapers to a few of the houses. After wondering to myself if anyone still actually reads the newspaper, my attention was turned to my neighbor, who was still standing exactly where I had left him, coffee cup in hand, smiling from ear to ear. As the young man on the bike passed by my neighbor's house, he had set the coffee cup down and was already halfway down the driveway to snatch the newspaper up. I guess that answers my previous question, I thought to myself before being immediately startled as my neighbor whipped around, newspaper in hand, smile on his face, making direct eye contact with me as I stared from my window. My stomach dropped, and at first, I thought it was because I had just been caught in what appeared to be a very compromising and creepy position. But as a few seconds passed, I realized that the feeling in the pit of my stomach wasn't the shame of being caught, but instead it was that churning feeling you get when you know someone's about to give you bad news, or when you've seen something that you shouldn't have. To lessen the awkward tension, I raised one hand in a half-hearted wave again and smiled weakly. My neighbor, still smiling, gripped the newspaper in one hand and offered a hearty dad-style, "Hey there," hand raise with the other. Then he just stood there, holding his newspaper and smiling at me. Oof, I thought. Maybe the daytime isn't for me after all. I let out a nervous chuckle to myself and closed the curtains. The interaction had been painfully uncomfortable, for me at least, and wasn't really the way I had planned on starting my new life as a sunlight-dwelling member of society. I went back into the living room and switched from Netflix to a video game so I could keep myself occupied. This made my first day tolerable, and I managed to actually keep myself awake until 8 p.m., where I subsequently passed out for the rest of the night. Since I had gone to bed so early, I woke up at around 5 a.m., wide awake and ready to take on the day. I would need to work on adjusting the exact hours that I was awake or sleeping to better accommodate a normal social life, but this was a good start. After brushing my teeth and puttering around my kitchen, I realized I didn't have any good breakfast food in my fridge or pantry, something that would need to be resolved immediately if I wanted to be a normal functioning member of daytime society. I put my jacket on and walked out to my car, but not before getting that uneasy, someone is watching you feeling while hitting the unlock button on my keys. I turned to see my neighbor, same position as yesterday, coffee cup in hand in pocket, smile on face. After wondering to myself if he was possibly a hallucinogenic side effect of my brain attempting to transition to an entirely new sleep schedule, I offered another half smile and got into my car. As I pulled away down the street, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror. To my surprise, he was actually now halfway down the driveway, watching me drive away. That increasingly unsettling smile stretched across his face. I'd love to say that was the last time I had such an encounter with him, but this was a recurring theme that would repeat itself for several more days, until I had finally managed to shift my sleeping schedule from 8 to 5 to 10 to 7, thanks to beginning my stint on the day shift at work. I never had any more bizarre stare-downs with my creepy neighbor, but I always noticed that his newspaper in particular was always taken inside long before anyone else on the street had claimed theirs. I didn't think much about it until yesterday morning, It was my first day off, so I didn't set an alarm and decided to wake up whenever my body woke me up. To my shock, I was awoken by the sound of pounding on my front door at around 8 a.m. There I was, greeted by a detective and a police officer. The sight of flashing red and blue lights and yellow crime scene tape catching the corner of my eye from the front door. After asking them what was going on, they informed me that my next door neighbor had been murdered, and they wanted to know when the last time I had seen them was. I told them it had been a couple of days, and that I had seen him picking up his newspaper a couple days ago. They shared a puzzled look before telling me that my neighbor was in fact a woman, and that the medical examiner estimated that she had been killed at least a week ago due to the state of decomposition. She had lived alone, and her sister had asked the police to come and perform a wellness check after she hadn't returned any of her phone calls or answered the front door when she came to visit. I felt that familiar sinking feeling in my stomach as I asked them if maybe she had a husband or boyfriend that had been staying with her, explaining that I had seen a man there every day who seemed to freely enter and exit as he pleased. They told me that they couldn't divulge that sort of information to me due to the sensitive nature of the crime, but that upon initial inspection of the interior house, it did not appear that more than one person had been living there. After about 20 minutes of questioning, they thanked me and went on their way. I felt sick and disgusted by what I had just learned. After all, I couldn't provide them with any more information than what I had already given them. It's not like I struck up a conversation with the man I had seen or anything. I didn't know anything about him other than that he had a propensity for smiling and snatching newspapers as soon as they hit the ground. Something which I now realized was probably in an effort to avoid suspicion from the prying eyes of other neighbors, as the newspapers would have begun to pile up in my actual neighbor's absence. For the rest of the day, the only thing I could think of was that awful, unsettling smile. How that whack job had looked at me in the eyes and had gone about his business, all while my actual neighbor was inside, probably in the early stages of decomposition. Looking back, the warning signs were probably there. Maybe it's just hindsight, but in my memory, I distinctly remember that in all of our limited interactions, the man was wearing the same exact clothes. That should have been a red flag. But honestly, it was pretty low on the list of creepy things about the guy. That was yesterday, and I know I shouldn't beat myself up about it, but I seriously wish there was more I could give the police. The fact that they didn't even know anything about the suspect being around the house told me that they definitely didn't know enough to have caught him yet. I had a hard time sleeping last night, so I'm up pretty early again. I thought I might go to my local 24-hour diner to clear my head, but as I was leaving my neighborhood, I noticed one of the front doors opening to a house down the street, and someone walking outside in my rearview mirror. I was already pretty far away, and maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I could have sworn that in the reflection, I saw the subtle white gleam of someone smiling at me as they watched me drive away. I hate the airport. I couldn't help but think that as I stood in yet another baggage check line. The sounds of whirring belts and the clattering of shoes on the hard ground filled the space around me. Parents nearby trying to calm their disgruntled children as they fought and screamed with all their might. The elderly in front of me moving like molasses, bringing everything around them to a standstill. The clerks at each of the counters, giving off 1,000-yard stares if they all had just served in a hellish war. Although my disdain for this place was great, it was a necessary evil that I had to face for my job. It's hard to be a traveling consultant if, well, I'm not traveling. Some of you might ask why I don't find some other work, and while that is an option, most starting positions wouldn't give me the salary or benefits I am currently receiving. I walked up to the counter and handed the woman my ticket and ID. She never made eye contact with me the entire time. She just punched the keys on her computer before asking me to set my bags down on the scale. I hoisted them up and set them down. A few moments later, she printed out some tags and placed my bags on the conveyor belt behind her. She handed me my receipt and told me to enjoy my flight. Despite all my misgivings about air travel, I was planning on enjoying this flight, as I had been traveling basically non-stop since the beginning of the year, flying all over the country and performing inspections at the various locations owned by my company. This time, however, I was flying back home to enjoy an entire month off from work. After passing through security, I made my way over to my gate. I was early, so I had to find a seat nearby to wait for my plane to land. I ended up having to sit in between a family whose kids seemed to be shouting at an iPad at irregular intervals, and a man shoveling some form of a sandwich into his face. I shifted and turned my attention to my phone, in an effort to block out everything around me. Time seemed to blur, and I was startled out of my scrolling by a voice announcing that they were going to start boarding soon. I snapped my attention up and looked around. I glanced towards the nearby window and saw that the plane was sitting at the gate as if it had been there the whole time. I rubbed my eyes before standing up and making my way over to the gate. One by one, we all filed into that small hallway that led to the plane itself. As I stood on the cusp of the connector and the plane, I couldn't help but feel a strange shift in the air around me. It only lasted for a fraction of a second, but it was like the air felt 10 times heavier than normal, before immediately dissipating. I filed back towards my seat and sat down. I then began my usual routine of silently praying for decent passengers around me. Though my prayers were rarely answered, after a few moments, the flight attendants shut the doors. I looked around and saw that the plane was actually fairly empty. There were still some passengers about, but the plane wasn't packed. There was only one person to my right, and he seemed like a younger man, in his early 20s. He sat there and scrolled on his phone much like I had been earlier. I thanked the benevolent gods and glanced out of the window, as the attendants began to rattle off flight procedures. After the demonstration, the plane began to taxi onto the runway. A few nerve-wracking seconds passed before my upper body had become compressed into my seat. Before I knew it, the plane was already leveling out in the sky. I stared out of the window as the ground slowly faded beneath the clouds. I checked my watch before shutting the window next to me and closing my eyes. I never used to be able to sleep on planes. Something about having people constantly around me, and the intermittent turbulence. But after a few years of this job, I had quickly learned how to block everything out and drift off. Shortly after I had fallen asleep, I was jolted awake by the plane shaking violently. I leaned forward and groggily opened my eyes. The plane was clearly hitting some heavy turbulence, but this was far more than I had ever experienced before. After a few nauseating seconds, the plane evened out and the shaking stopped. I looked around, and that's when I noticed something was off. The young man that was sitting next to me was no longer looking down at his phone. He was staring at the seat in front of him. Still desperately trying to wake up, I glanced down at my watch. It took me a moment to realize that the hands on my watch hadn't moved since we had taken off. I shook my wrist before bringing my watch to my ear. Battery must have died, I thought. I slid up the screen on the window and looked outside. I felt my heart seize in my chest as my brain tried to make sense out of what I was seeing. The sky was black. There were no clouds, just an empty void. I looked down, and there was nothing. No ground, no water, just darkness. This didn't make sense to me for multiple reasons aside from the obvious. My flight was only supposed to be 2.5 hours. I boarded my plane at 1:30 p.m., so there was no way it should be this dark outside, even if we were flying through a storm. I sat back in my seat and rubbed my eyes once again. I tried to look past the seats in front of me. and every single person was doing the same thing as the guy sitting next to me. They were all staring straight ahead. I wasn't sure what was going on. I pulled out my phone and attempted to turn it on. The screen glowed briefly for a few seconds before going dark again. I was beginning to think that I was still asleep, that this was all just a very vivid dream. Then I heard a noise which drew my attention behind me. It sounded like someone cracking their knuckles. I turned and peeked through the small space in my chair. There was something at the back of the plane. It was standing in the aisle. It was difficult to see because towards the back of the plane was completely dark, as if all the lights in the rear of the cabin had been snuffed out. It was tall and thin, with its head nearly scraping the roof of the cabin. Its long fingers cracked and popped as it placed its hands on the seat next to it. That was the sound that had drew my attention. It would stop, lean down into one of the aisles, then return back to its previously standing position. As it moved down the aisle, the lights would flicker out one by one. Upon leaning into another aisle, as it was returning to its standing position, its eyes seemed to lock with mine through the small crack in my seat. I snapped forward, and I could feel sweat beginning to bead on my forehead. I shut my eyes tightly, hoping to God that I would just wake up, and I'd be safely back on the ground. I opened my eyes once again, and just as I did, the lights above me flickered out. That thing was getting closer. It finally reached my aisle, and it was standing just inches away from the man to my right. I opened my eyes and stared straight ahead, not daring to blink. It bent down and leaned in. Through the corner of my eye, I could see its face clearly. Its head was grotesque. It was like it was rotting. Its skin was gray and marred with scratches and missing flesh. My grip on the armrest tightened as I looked towards the lower half of its face. It was gone. Its entire lower jaw was missing. A slimy black tongue just hung loosely from the back of its neck. It seemed to stare into the man's eyes for a few seconds, before turning its attention to me. Its neck seemed to extend all on its own, and its head floated directly in front of me. I quieted my breathing and stared blankly ahead. My calm demeanor was just a product of the paralyzing fear I was currently under. It looked me in the eyes, and I could see that its eyes were a ghostly shade of white. It had no pupils whatsoever. The seconds passing by felt like an eternity. Then, its neck began to retract, and it continued on down the aisle. I let out a shaky breath, and watched as it repeated this process for each aisle. Then, suddenly, it stopped at an aisle a few feet ahead, and a loud shriek filled the cabin. It reached in and ripped someone out of their seat. It dragged them into the very center of the aisle, before vanishing in a cloud of black smoke. The plane began to shake violently once more, and I shut my eyes praying for it to stop. When it finally did, I opened them again, and saw that there was light peeking through the window on my left. I looked to my right and saw the young man was staring at his phone. He turned and saw that I was drenched in sweat, and had a panicked look on my face. He then asked me if I was all right. I exhaled heavily, and nodded, telling him I just had a bad dream. The plane eventually landed, and as I was disembarking, I stopped next to the seat where the creature had made that terrible noise. The seats were completely empty, but I noticed that on one of them, the seatbelt had been torn in half. I swallowed my nerves and exited the plane. When I was finally back on the ground, I walked over to a wall and just leaned against it for a bit. I pulled my phone out and looked at it. Something instantly caught my attention. It was the date. An entire week had passed since I had gotten on that plane. I had arrived at the airport at 1:30 p.m. on Sunday, and it was now 4:15 p.m. on Saturday. I checked my tickets and they all say 1:30 p.m. Saturday the 7th, but I know that isn't right, because I had completed my consultation on Saturday the 29th of February, and my flight home was the next day. I checked all my travel info and they all said the same thing, that my departure time was Saturday the 7th at 1:30 p.m. I sighed and wondered if I had simply gotten my dates mixed up. But then, I looked down at my wrist. My watch, which had died during the flight, it was still dead. But as I looked at the small face, in the tiny little box that shows the date, it showed a 1. I have so many questions. Like, what was that thing? Where did it come from? Why did it target that random person, and where did it take them to? Why did we all lose a week of our lives, but none of the other passengers seemed to notice? Nothing about that flight makes any sense. Regardless, I think during my time off from work, I'm going to apply for a new position, so I never have to step foot inside an airport. Ever. Again. The other day, my son asked me if I had ever encountered something scary, like a ghost or a monster. I took a moment to think about the answer, but that moment was fleeting. I had, in fact, encountered something truly terrifying when I was younger, and I've decided to write it down while the memory is still fresh in my mind. I grew up in southern Michigan in the late 80s, early 90s. During that time, we didn't have all the fancy bits of technology that we do nowadays. Wow, just writing that sentence made me feel like I'm 1,000 years old. However, it was a true statement. We weren't as connected back then as we are now. And to circumvent that, we all had to go outside and enjoy each other's company. My friends and I would hang out all over town. On the weekends, we'd all emerge from our households and begin biking all over the neighborhood. Usually, we'd just pick one of our respective houses to relax at, but our parents would often tell us to go hang out somewhere else. Over time, we'd journey from place to place. We spent a lot of time hanging out in front of the local 7-Eleven, but unless we had money, they often told us to hit the bricks. There was a church nearby that for some reason always seemed perpetually closed. Even on Sundays, we would never see anybody there. We would hang on the back stairs of the building near the parking lot. Eventually, police would show up and tell us all that we were trespassing and to find another place. Overall, there weren't many locations in which we could just hang out together. But there was one spot in town which was very popular with families. It was Braxton Park. Braxton Park was a large park that held all sorts of events, from fairs to town barbecues to school festivals. It was a large chunk of land that seemed to stretch endlessly. At the southern end of the park, there were 3 basketball courts and a tennis court, all lined with fences. On the northern end was the main playground area. It had been recently installed and all the equipment there was brand new. Brightly colored slides and swings dotted the edges, while the main play area filled the center. In between the courts and the playground were nothing but scattered trees, too sparse to be considered a forest, and too dense to drive a car through it. Well, that is if you weren't careful. Off on the eastern edge of the park was the remnants of the previous play area. Tall metal slides that seemed to stretch high into the sky. They were much bigger than the new ones, which were made out of plastic, probably installed for safety reasons. Thinking back, I remember how the metal slides would sear your legs and back if you used it in the summer. If you were unfortunate to fall off the slide near the top, well, you were in for quite a drop. Right next to those metal slides were a few rusted sets of swings which seemed like they would break apart at any moment. On the western side of the park was a recreational facility, which housed a hockey rink as well as a main basketball court. My friends and I never went inside that place though, because it was usually rented out by amateur sports teams for days and weeks at a time. During most days, especially on the weekend, the park would be packed with people. The basketball courts would always be full of people shooting hoops. The main park area would be crowded with the frantic shrieks of children running around. Distant sounds of score buzzers could be heard emanating from the rec center. However, not many people like to hang out at the remnants of the old park on the eastern side. Honestly, there wasn't much there to begin with. Just the slides and swings I had mentioned previously, and a few picnic tables. My friends and I would park our bikes at the tables and we'd spend our day there just having fun. Occasionally, a family would wander over with their child from the other end of the park. We'd all sit and watch as the kids would scream when the slides would burn their legs and arms. The parents would glare at us as we all laughed amongst ourselves. After all, it was a lesson every one of us had to learn firsthand. They'd march off and we'd go back to chatting amongst ourselves. At around 6 p.m., the crowds would start to disperse, and the sun would lazily begin to set. By 8 o'clock, the entire park would be empty. We usually never hung around past 6 or 7 p.m. because our families would be expecting us home for dinner. However, during summer, that was a different story. It was the summer of '95. One Saturday morning, we had all met up with one another. We rode our bikes over to the park and arrived at our usual spot. Matt, who happened to be a year older than us, brought along his boombox. We sat there at the picnic table listening to music and eating the various snacks we had brought along with us. The hours steadily ticked by, and before we knew it, the sun was already beginning to set. After another hour, the entirety of the park was dark, aside from the basketball courts, which had some streetlights nearby illuminating the area. I asked my friends if they had to head home for dinner, but they all remarked that their parents didn't really cook during the weekdays due to working so much. I nodded in agreement, as my parents were the same way. They usually just left some cash for pizza and told us to fend for ourselves. We continued talking with one another until Matt piped up and told us to be quiet for a minute. We all looked at him wondering what he was about to say. He said that he thought he saw someone moving near the trees in the distance. Of course, we mocked him for this, but he just told us to shut up once again. We all quieted down despite a few laughs here and there. After a minute or two, we all went back to chatting. Then, another hour passed. I mentioned that it was probably time to head back home. Everyone else seemed to agree with me. We all stood up from the table and walked over to our bikes. As we moved, I noticed that one of us had stopped walking. It was Jeff. He was standing as stiff as a board. I asked him if he was alright, and this prompted the others to stop and turn as well. He just lifted a shaky finger and pointed off to the distance. I turned and saw it. There was a child no more than 7 or 8 years old, standing in between the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at us. I turned and saw the color drain from Matt's face when he saw the boy. Then, one by one, more of these kids began to show up from behind the darkened trees. A minute or two passed by, and there were now at least 20 silhouettes standing all around us. I told my friends we should probably just get going, and they all nodded to me. Matt walked over to his bike first, and in the blink of an eye, one of the kids was now standing directly in front of him. A moment later, Matt was on the ground convulsing violently. I sprinted over to his side, ready to push the kid away from him. When I arrived, I could see the boy clearly. His skin was like paper, and his expression was vacant. But that's not what rooted me in place. The boy didn't have any eyes, like they had been ripped out from his skull. I quickly looked around and saw that all the other children were now much closer than before. In that brief moment of distraction, I felt something touch me, and I looked back at the boy in front of me. His hand was resting on my chest. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain shoot throughout my body. It felt like a million needles were puncturing my skin. Then the pain coalesced at my heart, and I fell to the ground clutching my shirt. It felt like someone had reached into my body, grabbed a hold of my heart, and squeezed it as hard as they could. I could feel my vision fading in and out. I had no idea what just happened to me, but there was nothing I could do other than lie there in pain next to Matt. I could hear the dissonant screams of my remaining two friends as they shouted incoherent words to one another. After a minute or two, I could feel my body being dragged over dirt and grass. The pain in my chest was slowly subsiding, but I still couldn't make out what was going on. Another 10 minutes passed, and I started to come back around. Apparently, Jeff and Ryan had grabbed us and dragged us out of the park. 20 more minutes passed, and I could finally catch my breath. The pain seemed to have faded entirely. Matt finally came to and recovered as well, and we all sat there not saying a single word. Ever since that day, my friends and I have never stepped foot in that park again. Years have passed by since then, and we have all fallen out of touch with one another, but I'm positive they all remember that night as clearly as I do. I think about that night frequently. Sometimes, whenever I'm driving home late at night after work, and I pass by one of the local parks in town, for a split second, I catch a glimpse of multiple silhouettes, all of them standing there motionless, in the dark, watching me as I slowly drive away. I should tell you about it. Maybe you know it already. The rise in the number of deaths, the homicides, the murders, the crazy people, and then those things that came afterwards. I was there when we discovered the spores that started this whole mess. In the 1980s, an independent group of scientists, myself included, embarked on an expedition to Africa to search for a notorious, maddening substance only known to locals as Wansin. Apparently, this substance was spread through beautiful blom flowers, which were found around the area. When inhaled, the Wansin spores cause madness and dementia in the natives. The effects vary, though most of the time, they turn mad and seek a desire to attack one another. I saw them stab themselves with spears and sticks and such, bashing foreheads as they went. They inflicted wounds onto themselves. Some injuries were enough to kill them naturally, but they still kept fighting. We studied a victim in a lab west of Kijuju, sealing him in a plate glass sealed room with one-way mirrors. We left him adequate food and water and sealed him inside. From him, we learned of the necrosis that was happening on his skin. First, the skin pales. In this case, the native turned his otherwise dark skin into a dry, cracked gray. Blotches start to form, then sores. Through weeks of isolation, we saw the skin turn from a gray, cracked husk into a greenish sore, all while he blabbered on in Afrikaans. Days later, the man expired. As he was being prepared for burial, we noticed that the corpse was twitching rapidly. It was too strange to be called necrotic twitching. It was as if the corpse still wanted to move. After a rapid succession of twitching, the corpse simply went limp. We attempted another experiment. Apparently, that led me to my second discovery. The spores induced mutations in the body, if the tissue damage was severe enough. The spores induced cellular reproduction within the bloodstream. creating cell after cell after cell. We knew something was wrong. A heavily wounded man exhibiting the symptoms of the Blom spores started to grow an inhuman amount of muscle and tissue around the injured parts of his body. We sedated him and placed him in an isolated room for study. The results were astonishing. The Wansin spores regenerated parts of the wounded man's body, with a red mass that gave a crimson pigmentation on the person's skin. The infected showed signs of an intense Wendigo psychosis, an insatiable desire to feed on a human's flesh. As the days passed by, I started to get weary and tired. I was also growing more frightened. The other scientists were getting weary too. When the screaming started, the man was screaming his ears out. The screaming went on for days, until we woke up, heard nothing, and saw a bullet hole in his chest. The reddish man lay there. I asked Peters, our security, if he had done the euthanasia. No, he said. Angel grabbed my gun when I was sleeping. We walked over to Angel, the researcher, curled into a fetal position in the corner of the lab, gun in hand. She was sobbing and whispering. When we examined her for cuts and bruises, we saw a mark embedded in her arm. It was a bite mark. "It bit me. It bit me. I can't believe it bit me," she whispered. "I just wanted to take a blood sample from him, but he bit me. So I shot him. I shot him in the chest. That sick bastard." We had taken every precaution not to get infected with the Wansin agent, to the point of sterilization. Angel was obviously harboring the stage 1 symptoms of the Wansin complex. As we came closer to restrain her, she knew of our intent and shot herself in the chest. Not in the head where the brain would slumber forever, but the chest. After that incident, we decided to get the hell out of there. We gave them all proper burials and left Africa. Due to my colleague's Native American ancestry, we decided to name the condition as the Wendigo Complex. But the thing was, the case was far, far from over. There was a final symptom discovered, and out of the 4, this was the worst. The necrotic twitching I spoke of before. It gets worse. A Wansin-afflicted man was found deceased. As the coroner prepared his tools for the autopsy, he found the man shambling towards the door, ribcage exposed. The man, gray-skinned and pupilless, let out a long moan before falling to the floor, viscera spread all around. We were frightened with the news of the reanimated corpse, frightened beyond comparison to say the least. But, I suppose, it was already too late for us. Spreading the agent would only happen one way, through inhalation of spores. But with the outbreaks of disease near Blom-infested areas, the spores adapted, assimilated the characteristics of a new virus, turning it into a deadly, agile weapon. The agent could now spread through the blood. As such, the occurrences of the infected were spreading, but the virus didn't spread enough to gain people's attention. Until about a month later. Bizarre murders occurred around the region. People were apparently eaten. Sightings prevailed of groups of people eating other groups of people. It was madness. It was insanity. To the few who knew about the Wendigo complex, this was a depressing thought. Through the months until the revelation of the massive Wendigo outbreak, I've lost almost all of my colleagues. The first official sightings of the now-named Wendigo men were in a small Floridian island, Casey Key, but by that time, the virus was already spreading across the Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa, through the birds and the like. Innocent people around the world became insane. The Wendigo men didn't stay for long, but their slow, shambling relatives took their place. We, the remaining scientists who first discovered the virus, hesitated to call them what they really were. Just like in the movies, the virus was smart. The whole purpose of the symptoms was to turn the person into those things. Apparently, the virus not only causes necrosis, but causes already dead tissue to reanimate. The Blom-Wanson spores were acting as some kind of reanimating reagent. It was terrifying to think that almost everyone in the world was shambling stupidly, craving for the flesh of the living. But the virus was airborne, and the majority of the population had turned into these things. I don't know why I survived. The surviving group of scientists, myself included, were escorted by a convoy of medical officials towards an underground bunker in disguise of a farming ranch. We all huddled up there, waiting for a miracle. I still remember the look on the lead official's face a few years ago. He was unfazed from all the horrors that happened around him. The others looked up to him as a leader of this band of Americans that were. He's gone now. Every year, his strength waned. The moans of the living dead echoed through every night we spent there under that concrete bunker. Every year, there seems to be that one person that freaks out, and our numbers steadily declined. Gradually, the beasts got in. The leader, tired and weary, embraced them with open arms. He's gone now. During the scuffle, one of them got a chunk of my flesh when we pushed them back, however. Damn. I'm coughing now. Well, the necrovirus just spread throughout my lungs, I suppose. I wonder why I'm not going crazy yet. Just remember, when one gets infected, they're not the same person as before. The person is dead. It's just their body now. Be careful of the water too. Drink bottled water only. The virus is waterborne in some parts of the world. What else? Necrosis. The necrovirus usually causes necrosis. I said that before. Just watch out for patches of skin that seem odd. Dry skin. Itchy skin. If you read this, I cannot tell you how common those words were. But I don't know. I'm afraid to say the other lines. I can't speak of them. It's too horrible. I can't. I just can't. What I'm going to become is 10 times worse than anything I've ever imagined in this world. I can feel it eating away at my body. I'm dying. And I can't whimper. All my strength has gone to locking myself up. It's all for you. I stocked the closet at the back with supplies. A week's worth of food. My remaining boxes of shotgun shells. Pistol magazines. Ammunition. And 10 days worth of gas. Drive. Drive as far as Mexico. Whoever you are. Because they're still going to spread. And then go to Antarctica. As for me, I don't know. I'm dead. I'm deader than dead. Oh, pistol. You were always there for me. Its muzzle is caked with blood. I tried to use it on myself, just a few hours ago, but I decided not to. Instead, I shot one of those things in the face. And when I pushed the muzzle against my temple, it was so hot that it branded the skin on the side of my head. I winced a bit from the pain, though I thought of you, and I guess my pain didn't matter anymore. What matters now was the pain I'm causing you. I don't know how you... It doesn't even hurt a bit, even though blood just wells within my mouth. I just need a little water or something. I'm so itchy. Damn it. My right arm is all dry and patchy at parts. Hold on, I got a scratch. There. Itchy gone. Wait. I mean, the itch is gone. Maybe I'll just sit here and wait for it to get me. I can't pull the trigger. I want it to be over, but I can't. People. Upstairs. Not dead. I see. I have to scratch. Scratch. The itch is not gone. People are. I should go see who it is. I'm so hungry. My father was the best storyteller. Every single night growing up, I'd lie in bed awaiting my father to come in and tell me a bedtime story. His stories were incredible. To this day, I'm not entirely sure where he came up with most of his ideas. It seemed like almost every other night, he'd have an entirely new story for me. He would tell me about courageous yet flawed warriors seeking retribution for a heinous crime done to them. He'd speak of mythical worlds that I could only barely comprehend. There would be stories of true love, of failure, of victory, of honor. I'd lay there hanging on to every word as he regaled me with each tale. Eventually, my fatigue would grow too great, and my mind would slip off into a deep, deep sleep. One day, when my father came in to tell me yet another story, I asked him if he could make this one a scary story. He paused for a moment, giving me both a look of surprise and thoughtfulness. Out of all the stories he has told me, none of them had been particularly scary. They were more thrilling and action-packed. He sat there staring out of my window for a few seconds, before turning and smiling to me. Then he began to speak. "Those woods, right outside your window," he said. I glanced over to the window and saw the faint trees swaying in the moonlight. I nodded in response. He looked over his shoulder for a moment as if he were about to tell me a dangerous secret. "There's something in those woods." When he said this, I felt a chill drift into my room, though it was probably just in my head, to be honest. He continued, "Every 7 years, it emerges from the deeper reaches of the woods. It prowls around, crawling on all fours. It searches. It hunts. Its body is like a man's, but longer. Its arms and legs stretching out at odd angles. Its skin is like coal, which makes it difficult to spot during the night. Its head, long and narrow. But the most unsettling feature this creature has are its eyes. It has multiple eyes, all over its head, like a spider. It uses its multiple eyes to spot its prey in the dark. It creeps around through the night until it finds an unsuspecting victim, usually a drifter or someone unlucky enough to be outside during that time. Sometimes, when it has difficulty finding prey, it will venture into residential areas and search for unlocked windows. If it finds one, then it crawls inside the house and grabs the nearest person it can find. It drags them back outside and into the dark woods where it keeps them for 7 years, feeding off them until it's time to reemerge and hunt once again. I could feel my hands beginning to tremble slightly as I gripped my blanket next to me. My father, taking note of this, smiled down at me and told me not to worry. He said that as long as I keep my window locked, that I would be safe. He stood up from my bed and walked over to my window. He just stared out of it for a few seconds before checking to make sure it was locked. Just as he was about to shut off my bedroom light and close my door, I asked him if he had ever seen this thing before. He paused for a few moments, before a reassuring look crept onto his face. He didn't answer me. He just wished me a good night and shut my door behind him. I remember lying awake for most of that night, staring at my window, wondering if I would see that face my father described. A face with multiple eyes staring back at me. Eventually, my eyelids shut, and I fell asleep. While I slept, I dreamt that a shadowy figure had been chasing me. I ran as hard as my legs could carry me, but it was like I was running on a sheet of ice. It wrapped its arms around my legs and began dragging me through the grass. It was pulling me closer and closer to the forest, which was now in the shape of a giant maw. I was screaming, but I could hear no sound coming from my mouth. Then, just as I crossed the threshold, I was jolted awake, and I sat up in my bed screaming. It only took a few seconds for me to realize my room had been brightened by the light outside. I felt a weight lift off of my chest as I finally calmed down. Since that night, despite my father telling me new stories every other day, I couldn't help but think about the creature in the woods every time he'd leave my room. Thankfully, the nightmares didn't last very long, and over time, the story faded from my mind entirely. A few years later, my father passed away. He had developed cancer, and after months of battling it, the cancer selfishly won. That year was a dark time for my family. However, with the support of my family and friends, we all managed to pull through it. With each passing year, the grief lessened, but his memory still remained. Then after another few years, during my senior year in high school, something happened. I had gotten home from school and saw that my mom had already left for work. She had been working frequently the last few years to make up for the low income. I offered to get a part-time job to help her out with the bills, but she told me that everything was fine. She said that we weren't in dire need of money, and that working helps take her mind off of things. She also went on to say that I needed to focus on my schooling, so I could get into college and in turn get a good job down the line. Although I understood her reasoning, it still pained me to see her working so much. Regardless, I walked into my bedroom and tossed my bag onto my bed. I pulled out some of my books and set them on my desk. Every half hour or so, I'd split my time between doing homework, studying, and watching TV. Before I knew it, the sky had darkened, and it was time for bed. I shut off my TV, got changed, and crawled into bed. As I laid there, I found it difficult to fall asleep. My mind was restless, and despite my efforts, I couldn't seem to calm my thoughts. I cracked open one of my eyes and saw that the clock on my desk was nearing 2 a.m. by this point. That's when I heard something. A sound which pierced the silence of my room like a knife. It was a tap. A light yet sharp tap echoed around me. My eyes instantly snapped open and I looked over to my window. My blood nearly turned into ice in my veins. Memories of my father rushed into my mind. Memories of the stories he used to tell me. Memories of the thing that lives in the wood behind my house. Its face and body were obscuring most of my window, and if it weren't for the faint bit of moonlight outside, I probably wouldn't have seen it. There was a bunch of movement across its face, like multiple insects crawling on it. Then I realized that they weren't insects. They were its eyelids, opening and closing, looking around rapidly. As I laid there in disbelief, I wondered if I had fallen asleep and this was just a nightmare. Then, I watched as a shadowy limb stretched out towards the base of my window. My mind stopped thinking about whether or not this was a nightmare, and instead I thought about whether or not I had locked my window recently. The sickening sound of the window seal being broken as the glass began to slide up hit my ears. My fight or flight response kicked in, and I rolled out of my bed. I dashed across my room and opened my bedroom door. When I did, the door slammed shut in my face. All of my joints locked up simultaneously as I couldn't believe what just happened. The creature that was just outside my window a few seconds ago was now above me. It had one hand firmly pressed against my door. The other seemed to be stuck against my wall. Its head seemed to twist unnaturally, almost spinning entirely upside down. All of its eyes were focusing in on me. I backed away, wondering what I should do. My bedroom was on the second floor, so if I jumped, I probably would only injure myself. And if I didn't, I'd probably be right where it wanted anyway. Standing right next to my bedroom door was a coat rack my father had assembled for me years ago. I grabbed it and swung at the creature as hard as I could. The sound of an impact and splintering wood resonated around me. A few of the prongs snapped off. The creature had reared back slightly, but that only gave it a moment's pause. What was jarring to me was that this thing made no sound aside from the previous window tapping. No breathing. No shrieks of pain. No growls. Even moving around, it barely made any noise. It crawled onto the floor and was closing the distance to me. This forced me back over to where my bed was. It was now taking up nearly half of my room. It lowered its stance, and a second later, it lunged at me. It reached out with its long arms at me. When it did this, I swung the coat rack wildly. The end of the wood connected with its head. It clattered to the floor, and in a flash, I dashed past it. I opened my door and slammed it shut behind me. I sprinted down the stairs and turned on the living room light next to me. Then I stopped, keeping the coat rack aimed up at the stairs towards my bedroom door. Then, suddenly, the front door to my house opened up behind me, and I spun around on my heels ready to strike. I managed to stop myself at the last second, when I saw that it was my mom coming home late from work. She screamed at me and asked me what in the world I was doing. Breathless, I told her something had crawled into my bedroom from my window. She sighed heavily and stormed up the stairs. Despite my protest, she promptly opened my bedroom door. There was nothing there. Just a few pieces of splintered wood, and that was it. She scolded me for breaking the coat rack my father had gotten me, and told me to go back to bed. After inspecting my room, I found that there was truly no sign of that creature whatsoever. I quickly shut and locked my window tightly. I peered outside of it for a few moments, but it was far too dark to see anything of note. It was safe to say I didn't sleep at all that night. My father used to tell me incredible stories when I was a kid. To this day, I'm not entirely sure where he came up with most of his ideas. But the next morning, as I stared at the large handprint on the outside of my window that had been revealed by the morning sun, I know that at least one of his stories was true. This is a cautionary tale for anyone who uses social media, particularly Facebook. After what's happened to me, and all the bad that might come of it, I feel that at the very least, this might be able to serve as a warning for other people, so that they can avoid finding themselves in a similar situation. You see, I'm just your average Joe. Just a normal dude living by himself in a small house with my golden retriever, Max. I'm a shift manager at a local video game retail store. I've got an on-again, off-again girlfriend that I've been seeing for about a year now. I like watching sports and hanging out with my coworkers on my days off. And I have a pretty standard presence on social media. About 2 months ago, I actually narrowed down my online presence to pretty much just Facebook and Reddit. I had initially considered deleting my Facebook when I deleted Twitter off my phone. But Reddit really isn't for socializing, and posting a random status update or sharing an animal video every few months is enough to satisfy my mom's constant worrying that I might have died or moved to another country, without anyone letting her know. It's also kind of nice to see that no one else from my graduating high school class really went on to do anything special with their lives. Most of them have a spouse, maybe 1 or 2 kids, but none of them went on to be young millionaires or anything. My life may not be anything remarkable, but neither is theirs, and while that might be sad to say, it does make me feel a little bit better about myself. I never really did much on Facebook except scroll through the most recent posts and maybe share a viral video or two. I'm not one to engage in paragraph battles in the comment sections of controversial posts, but I would occasionally find myself scrolling through them to get a good laugh once in a while. The things that people fight over are pretty ridiculous, and for some reason, Facebook brings out the debate champion in everyone these days, but I guess that's how the internet has always been. Anyway, one morning on my day off, I found myself perusing the comment section of a pretty stomach-turning article that one of my aunts had decided to share for some reason. The article was about a grisly unsolved crime that took place in her area, and the people in the comment sections were rattling off with their theories and speculations about who might be responsible. Some people had rather controversial opinions of the discriminatory variety. Others blamed the government for a lack of law enforcement presence in the area. And some just echoed their thoughts and prayers for the victim, along with a praying hands emoji or two. Of course, also amongst the comments and commentators were the edgy trolls who were taking the opportunity to rile up the Facebook moms, with tasteless memes and GIFs making light of the details of the crime itself. I can have a pretty dark sense of humor from time to time, so I'm not above chuckling to myself at the clever use of a reaction image in response to something truly tragic. It might not be the best way to handle sensitive topics, but what good does it do anyone to read about something awful and let it control the rest of their day? Might as well make the best out of a bad situation. It's not like there's anything I could do to help the investigation or the victim anyway. But what caught my eye was a comment from a profile named Peter Stump, and it was just a sailboat emoji followed by the monkey covering its mouth emoji. For reasons that would be hard for me to explain, this comment actually caused me to chuckle to myself. Maybe it was the weird combination of inappropriate emojis in response to the horrible violent crime, or maybe it was the fact that the account that had posted the comment still had the anonymous gray avatar as their profile picture, and was using the name of a famous 16th century serial killer to rile up strangers on the internet. Regardless, for some reason the comment really tickled my funny bone, and I gave the comment a laugh reaction. Pretty harmless, right? Well, that's what I thought too. But that's where the trouble started. Within no more than 30 seconds of me reacting to the comment, I had received an invitation from the Peter Stump profile to join a private Facebook group called The Shipyard. A bit strange, I thought, but I wasn't actually a part of any Facebook groups, so I didn't really know much about them or the etiquette for joining one. This group was private, so I figured it was probably just a group for people with socially unacceptable humor to laugh at darker subject matter in peace without being lectured by every Karen and Susan with access to the internet. After hitting accept, I decided to check the group out. To my surprise, there wasn't really anything of note in the actual group. All existing posts were just default avatar-clad profiles posting the sailboat emoji, along with a string of numbers. I should mention that at the time, I was also using the default gray anonymous profile picture, so I fit right in. I scrolled along for 15 minutes, hoping to see something more interesting than this weird emoji sailboat thing, but no dice. It took me a few minutes to realize that the numbers following each sailboat were coordinates. Every one that I plugged into Google Maps showed pictures of fairly unassuming houses. Fair enough, I thought. Maybe these posts were all just introduction posts. It is called the Shipyard, after all. A sailboat, then the coordinates of your house. Maybe like a weird secret code or something. I had never really gotten to be part of a club, and it seemed harmless enough. So I submitted my own post, sailboat emoji, and the coordinates of my house. I waited a while to see if anyone would react to my post to welcome me, but nothing happened right away. A few of the other posts had laugh reactions on them, so I figured that was a customary response to a post like mine. For the remainder of the day, I'd occasionally refresh my feed to see if anything happened, but nothing. No one responded, and I figured that I just wasted my time. Oh well. I woke up around 9 the next morning because I wasn't expected to be at work until noon. I hopped on my computer to see if I had any new notifications. I couldn't tell you why the approval of some random faceless strangers on the internet meant so much to me, but I was overwhelmed with the urge to see if I had been properly welcomed into this mysterious and random group of people. Nothing. No notifications. I was a little disappointed, but quickly got over it as I switched over to Reddit to browse for an hour or two. Around 30 minutes into my browsing, Max, my dog, started going nuts in the kitchen. I have a fairly tiny house, and the kitchen window is part of a little breakfast nook that looks out into some trees and a drainage ditch area. The curtains were closed, but when I came in to investigate the commotion, it was quickly apparent at what he was barking at. There was the shadow of a person, blocking the sunlight from behind the curtain on the outside of the window. Whoever it was standing at the edge of the trees, motionless, as Max barked and yelped at the disturbance. I had made the mistake of shouting at Max as soon as I came into the kitchen, which alerted whoever was standing outside the window of my presence. They immediately turned and began to retreat back into the trees, so quickly that by the time I had made it out the front door and around the corner to the back of my house, they were nowhere to be found. I considered calling the police, but what would I have told them? Yes, a nondescript figure that I had no further description of was casting a shadow into my kitchen and now they're gone. I don't think so. I calmed Max down and went back inside. I didn't really know what to do about what had just happened. For all I knew, it was just one of the neighbor kids playing a prank on me or wandering around outside my house. I tried to calm my nerves and sat back down to continue reading the funny Reddit thread that I had previously abandoned. Suddenly, I saw the tab that I had Facebook opened pop up with a new notification. I clicked over to see what it was, only to find that someone had finally interacted with my post. Chester Turner commented on your post in the shipyard. I clicked on the notification to see what was said, and my stomach dropped. In real time, I watched as the comment, a photograph of my kitchen window, was liked by nearly a dozen people simultaneously, and then the comment was subsequently deleted. Seconds later, one of the people who had liked the photo of my window left a laughing reaction on my post. I panicked and deleted the post right away, screenshotting everything I could about the group before deactivating my Facebook profile and calling the police. After turning over all the information that I had as well as all the screenshots, I called work and told them that I had a family emergency and that I would be out of town for a little while. I immediately packed myself and Max up and drove over to my mom's house a few hours away. While I was there, I received a call back from a detective that I was told would be following up on the investigation. He told me that while they weren't able to identify who had been outside my window that day, they were able to conduct the coordinates in many of the posts to active missing persons cases across the country. It's been a few weeks now, and I'm still staying with my mom for the time being. I don't know what exactly I did by putting my information on the shipyard, but one thing's for sure. I won't be reactivating my Facebook profile anytime soon. When I was a kid, my parents used to take a lot of road trips. It seemed like nearly every summer, I'd be whisked off to a different part of the country for one reason or another. During the early 90s, my father was a representative for a retail company, and often was required to visit various locations and meet with the staff. While we didn't travel with him all the time, mostly when I was in school and during the winter, he did bring us along during the summer trips. It was like having a vacation every single year. By the time I was 10 years old, I had visited or at least driven through nearly every state in the US. There are quite a few states that stick out in my mind when I think back to those years. The first one has to be Florida. As much as Florida gets a bad rap for being the retirement capital of the world, the beach and the ocean at the time were incredible. I remember making sandcastles for hours, going snorkeling in the vast ocean, and eating exorbitant amount of room service food. Despite the relentless sun and the humidity, I actually had a great time there. Another state that comes to mind would have to be Texas. Seeing the Alamo and walking along the river in San Antonio, eating my entire body weight in barbecue, going to a real live rodeo. I wore cowboy boots for the rest of that year. Not all of the trips were pleasant, mind you. There was one in particular that simply thinking back to it makes me shudder. We were driving back home from California one summer. As we crossed the border into Missouri, I was staring out of the car window pretending there was an imaginary guy running alongside the car. I know it sounds silly, but it was just something I used to do as a kid. I'd pretend he was like a ninja weaving through trees, jumping over telephone poles, and dashing across guardrails. As this imaginary companion jumped and sprinted along, his image began to fade as my eyes started to focus on something else off in the distance. I raised my head and I could see it clearer with each passing second. Large arcing shapes in the distance, brightly colored spinning buildings. It was some type of fair or carnival. I called out to my mom and told her to look. She turned and gave the cliched mom response of, "Oh, that's nice, dear." Feeling defeated before I even start, I asked her if we could stop there. She told me that we couldn't spare any time, that we needed to make it home soon. I groaned quietly in the back seat. Meanwhile, my father, who was driving the car, looked at me in the rearview mirror. He gave me a sly wink and then turned off the highway. My mother scolded him for deviating, but he just said that he had been driving for hours and wanted to take a break anyway. My mom huffed in the passenger seat, while my eyes became glued to the window. As we approached, the attractions grew larger and larger. A towering Ferris wheel stretched high into the blue sky above. A few small roller coasters snaked out from the edges of the fair. Multicolored stands dotted the area on the other side of the chain link fence. We parked the car, and before the engine had been shut off, I was already standing outside. The sights, smells, and sounds assaulted my senses. I ran over to my dad's side of the car and tugged on his sleeve as he was taking his time getting out. Walking towards the entrance of the fair, I could feel a sense of wonder and excitement beginning to swell within me. I had been to fairs before, but I was always too short to ride any of the rides myself, so I often just played some games and ate some sugary snacks before leaving. This time, however, I was sure I had grown enough to ride many, if not all of the rides. As we walked up to the entrance, I looked up and saw a semi-rusted metal sign. The sign stuck out to me as odd, as the rest of the fair looked relatively clean and tidy. The sign that hung above looked old and weathered. Through the patches of orange-colored rust, the word Dreamland in faded yellow letters could be seen. As I walked underneath the sign, my father remarked that they should probably get a new one. Stepping into the fairgrounds was like walking into another world. Screaming kids rushing by while exhausted parents followed behind them. The ringing bells and buzzers from the multiple game stands echoed around me. My dad ushered us over to a small kiosk where a woman sat on her phone. Without glancing up, she droned, "Welcome to Dreamland. May all your dreams come true." My dad bought me a wristband which permitted me access to any of the rides. I thanked him and looked down at my wrist excitedly. Minutes seemed to fly by as I stuffed sugary candy and fried desserts into my face. I played and won multiple games, forcing my dad to hold on to my prizes as we walked along. As I waited in line for the Ferris wheel, my parents stood off to the side watching me. I approached the guy operating the ride and he looked me over for a moment. He told me to stand next to the height measurement sign. I swallowed my nerves and stepped up, trying to puff out my chest as if that would make me any taller. After a moment, he waved his hand at me to get on the ride. Relief and elation rushed through my mind as I climbed into one of the carts. As I rode the Ferris wheel, I was in awe of how far I could see. Glancing down, my parents looked like ants from all the way up there. Before I knew it, the ride was over, and I was rushing over to my parents to tell them how much fun it was. As we were walking along, my mother sighed and nudged my dad. He solemnly shook his head and told me that I could ride one more ride before we had to hit the road. I groaned once again, but understood. I looked around carefully, considering my options. There was the tilt-a-whirl spinning up right next to me, the oversized slide in the distance, the massive swinging pirate ship on my left. Those were all placed in the back of my mind as I looked at one of the two roller coasters this place had. I told my parents to follow me as I ran over to them. They begrudgingly followed along. Of the two coasters that looked nearly identical to me, one had a very long line while the other seemed vacant, aside from the attendant manning the ride. I rushed through the empty ropes and up to the man. He glanced down at me with a stern gaze. He didn't say a word, just pressed a single button on his console, and the gate behind him seemed to pop open. I entered and sat in the middle section of the 3-car ride. He walked over to me and lowered the bar. He leaned in real close to me for a moment and whispered, "Keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times, or you might lose them." When he said that, it almost snapped me out of my excitement. He walked back over to his console and pressed another button. With a shift in momentum, I was pressed back into my seat as the ride started. The metallic clicks of the car being lifted high in the air vibrated through my shoes. The first car arched over the edge, and my car followed suit. Instantly, I could feel the wind pressing onto my face as I hit turn after turn. There was only a single loop in this ride, and I could feel the blood rush to my head and face as I completed it. The ride came around towards the end and began to dive. Right before the end of the ride, there was a long stretch of tunnel, done up to look like a mine shaft of sorts. The car entered it, and suddenly, without warning, the car abruptly stopped. I felt my stomach ache as it lurched into the safety bar. I could feel tears beginning to form as I was on the verge of crying from the pain, when I heard a sound in front of me. It sounded like someone was walking towards me. I wondered if it was the ride operator coming to get me after a malfunction. The sounds grew louder and louder, though I couldn't see anything due to the lightless interior of this tunnel. Uncertainty gave way to fear as I felt something jostle the first car in front of me. My voice wanted desperately to call out, but something inside of me was telling me to hide and not give away my presence. I sat there, covering my mouth as tears streamed between my fingers. After a moment of silence, I felt something brush the side of my cheek. It felt like warm air was hitting me, like someone was breathing on me. My eyes shifted to the right, and staring at me was a boy. My eyelids opened so wide I could feel my eyes beginning to sting. This boy's face wasn't right. His face held a bluish tint to it. Lifeless eyes rolled into the back of his skull. Greenish holes and scabs dotted his cheeks. His mouth hung slack as the sickly warm breath exhaled against me. Then, another breath hit me on my left, and I turned slightly towards it. This one was a girl's face. Long, greasy brown hair dangled from her scalp. One eye was missing entirely, while the other stared directly at me. I shrunk down in my seat as much as I could, and one by one, more faces began to appear. They all circled me like a twisted staring contest. Then, directly in front of me, a new face appeared. This one wasn't a child's face. It wasn't even human. In fact, it wasn't even really a face. Just a smooth, pale head cut through the darkness. No eyes, no nose. Just a large, jagged grin. Like somebody forgot to add the other features when making the face. Its teeth opened up like a metal gate, and a long tongue protruded out like a snake. Pointed, with strings of ichor dripping off of it. It pressed its tongue against my cheek, and finally, I screamed. I screamed so hard that I passed out. When I came to, I was outside in the grass with my parents. My mother was frantic while my father was checking to make sure I was okay. They asked me what happened, and I couldn't seem to answer them. My father mentioned that the ride was probably too intense for me and that I passed out as a result. I nodded apprehensively. He then helped me up, and as we were walking towards the exit, I looked back at the ride one last time. I can't be sure, but I thought I saw that same tongue scraping along the outside edge of that tunnel before slithering back inside. To this day, I'm not sure how I made it out of there alive and in one piece. I'm not even sure if what I saw really happened or if it was like my father said. Regardless, ever since then I've refrained from going anywhere near a fair or a carnival. Whenever my father would take us on another road trip, and I'd see one of those fairs in the distance, I'd shudder and think about all those faces I saw in that tunnel, and how close I was to joining them.